There is a kind of evidence that has been sitting in plain sight for over 1,000 years. Not buried in soil. Not locked in a laboratory. Spoken, written, inherited, and passed from parent to child without anyone fully understanding what it carried. A surname. For most people, a family name is just a label. Something on a passport, a mailbox, a gravestone. But for historians, linguists, and increasingly, geneticists, certain English surnames are something else entirely. They are fragments of a migration that happened over 1,500 years ago, when a patchwork of Germanic peoples crossed the North Sea and began to reshape an island that was never quite the same again. The story we were taught in school was simple. Rome left Britain. The Angles, the Saxons, and the Jutes arrived. England was born. Clean, tidy, finished. Except it was not clean. And it was not finished. Because buried inside thousands of ordinary British and American surnames are linguistic fossils, names that encode occupation, geography, and ancestry from a world that predates the England we recognize today. And in recent years, DNA studies looking at Y chromosome lineages and regional genetic clustering across England have started to ask an uncomfortable question. Do certain surnames actually correlate with detectable Anglo-Saxon genetic ancestry? The early evidence suggests something more interesting than a simple yes or no. This is the story of 14 surnames, the buried world they came from, and what the genome may or may not confirm about the people who carried them. Before we go further, it helps to understand what historians actually believed for a long time. The traditional model was migration by replacement. Angles from what is now northern Germany and southern Denmark. Saxons from the regions still called Saxony. Jutes possibly from Jutland. They arrived in the 5th and 6th centuries, and according to the old narrative, they did not just settle among the native Romano-British population. They displaced them, pushing British Celtic speakers to the western fringes of the island, into Wales, Cornwall, and Cumbria. It was a story with a clear before and after. Celtic Britain. Then Anglo-Saxon England. A hard border in time. This model explained a lot. It explained why English is a Germanic language and not a Celtic one. It explained why place names across most of England are Old English in origin. And it explained why surnames tied to Anglo-Saxon vocabulary spread so widely. But there was a problem historians noticed early on, even before genetics entered the conversation. If the native British population was truly pushed out or wiped out, where did all the Celtic river names come from? Rivers like the Thames, the Avon, the Trent, carry names older than the Angles and Saxons themselves. If replacement was total, why would conquerors preserve the language of a people they had erased? That was the first crack. A small one. Easy to explain away. Rivers persist, some argued, even when populations do not. Then genetics arrived, and the crack widened. Researchers began sequencing Y chromosome DNA, the genetic material passed almost unchanged from father to son across English regions, comparing it to samples from Frisia, Denmark, and northern Germany, the ancestral homeland of the historical Angles and Saxons. What they found was not a simple story of total replacement, and it was not a simple story of total continuity either. In parts of eastern and central England, the data showed a substantial genetic contribution from continental northern Europe, consistent with real, large-scale Anglo-Saxon migration. But in the West, and in pockets throughout the country, older British ancestry persisted at surprisingly high levels. The picture that emerged was not conquest and erasure. It was layering. Migration on top of survival. New arrivals settling among, marrying into, and gradually blending with a population that never fully disappeared. That is where the surnames come back into the story. If you enjoy this kind of science-driven history, where genetics and etymology start to overlap in unexpected ways, consider subscribing, because there is far more hidden in ordinary names than most people realize. Surnames as we know them did not exist during the original Anglo-Saxon migrations. They developed centuries later, mostly after the Norman conquest of 1066, as English society needed more precise ways to distinguish between people. But when surnames finally crystallized, many of them were built directly from Old English, the language the Angles and Saxons brought with them. In that sense, a surname can function like linguistic sediment. It may not prove direct, unbroken male line descent from a 5th century migrant, but it often preserves the vocabulary, geography, and social structure of the Anglo-Saxon world in a way almost nothing else does. Here is where the genome and the archive start to speak to each other, imperfectly, but meaningfully. Take the name Wood, or its variants Atwood and Woods. Rooted in the Old English word woodoo, it likely began as a descriptor for someone who lived by or worked in a forest. Simple, practical. Anglo-Saxon settlements were built around exactly these kinds of geographic markers. Or consider hill, from the Old English hwo, someone who lived on or near elevated ground. In regions of England where Y chromosome studies show strong continental Germanic signal, names like this appear with notable frequency, though researchers are careful to stress that frequency is not proof of individual lineage. Then there is Fisher, from Old English fisir, a name tied to one of the oldest professions in a coastal and river-threaded landscape. Anglo-Saxon settlement patterns hubbed waterways for exactly the reasons this name implies: food, trade, and defense. Walker offers something different, an occupational name derived from wilkin, referring to someone who fold cloth, a physically demanding process of cleaning and thickening wool by trampling it in water. It is a detail that connects a modern surname directly to Anglo-Saxon textile economy. Then there is a name like Wright, from Writa, meaning craftsman or builder. Cartwright, Wainwright, and Wheelwright all descend from this same root, each one a fossil of a specific trade that mattered enormously in a pre-industrial agrarian society. Names like Shepherd and Coward, the latter meaning cowherder rather than anything related to cowardice, point toward the pastoral backbone of Anglo-Saxon life. Livestock management was not incidental. It was survival. Geography-based names carry their own weight. Ashby, Whitby, and dozens of by suffix names actually point toward later Danish Viking settlement layered on top of the earlier Anglo-Saxon world, since by is Old Norse for settlement, not Old English. This is where the story gets more complicated, because England was not shaped by one migration. It was shaped by several, stacked across centuries. Angles and Saxons first, then Vikings, the Normans. Each layer left linguistic and possibly genetic traces that surnames still carry today. That is not a contradiction to the Anglo-Saxon story. It is a signal that the full picture is layered, not linear. Names like Godwin, built from Old English elements meaning good friend, and Alfred-derived surnames such as Alvery or Avery, connect directly to the personal naming traditions of the Anglo-Saxon aristocracy, names once carried by kings and ealdormen, later filtering down into ordinary families as given names hardened into hereditary surnames. Then there is Kingman, Earl, and Knight, titles and social ranks from a stratified Anglo-Saxon and early medieval world, eventually adopted as surnames by families associated, however distantly, with those roles or professions. And finally, a name like Whitfield from Whit and Feld, meaning white or clear open field, a landscape descriptor from a world where cleared farmland was hard-won and worth naming. 14 names. 14 small windows into a vanished world. But here is the critical caution, the part a responsible telling of this story cannot skip. Carrying one of these surnames does not mean a DNA test will reveal Anglo-Saxon Y chromosome ancestry. Surnames can be adopted, changed, translated, or passed down through lines that have nothing to do with the original bearer's biological ancestry. Migration, illegitimacy, name changes at Ellis Island, and simple coincidence of naming convention all complicate the picture. Genetic genealogists are consistently cautious here. A surname is a historical artifact of language and culture. It is not, by itself, a genetic certificate. What the science does suggest is something more nuanced and, in some ways, more interesting than a neat one-to-one match. Studies combining surname distribution mapping with Y chromosome analysis across the British Isles have found that in some cases, clusters of shared surnames do correlate with shared paternal genetic lineages, particularly in regions with historically low population mobility, where families stayed rooted to the same land for many generations. In other cases, the correlation weakens or disappears entirely. The evidence points toward a partial, regionally inconsistent relationship, not a universal rule. That is not the DNA failing to deliver an answer. That is the DNA describing something closer to the truth. Human ancestry rarely moves in straight, clean lines. It moves in currents, eddies, and confluences the same way rivers do. Picture, for a moment, the world these names came from. Low timber halls beneath gray skies. Smoke rising from a longhouse roof into cold morning air. A man called right shaping an axle by firelight while his neighbor, a woman known simply by her father's trade, mends a net by a river the Britons had named centuries before the Angles ever crossed the sea. Two languages overlapping in the same village. Two ancestries slowly becoming one bloodline, one dialect, one people, without either side fully realizing the merger was happening. That is the England beneath the England we think we know. If a name like Wood, or Walker, or Godwin sits somewhere in your family tree, it does not hand you a verified lineage back to the 5th century. But it does hand you a thread, a linguistic filament connecting you to a moment when Britain was being remade, when Roman order gave way to Germanic settlement, when Celtic survival quietly persisted beneath a new ruling language, and when the words people used to describe their neighbors, their trades, and their land began hardening into the names we still carry. Somewhere between the certainty of the old textbook story and the caution of modern genetics sits a truer version of the past. Not a clean replacement. Not a simple continuity. A slow, layered merging of peoples who never fully vanished and never fully arrived unchanged, leaving behind a language, a landscape, and, in the smallest and most ordinary detail imaginable, a set of surnames that still whisper where they came from. If you carry one of these names, or you are simply drawn to how much history survives in something as small as a word, let me know in the comments which name surprised you most, or which population's ancestry you think deserves the same kind of investigation next. The map of who we are was never finished. It was only ever incomplete, waiting for the next piece of evidence, the next name, the next signal buried in the archive of who we call ourselves.